Salvos on the issue of civil rights lately from some very conservative figures. This past weekend, of course, there was an event that got lots of national attention. On the anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, there was Fox News host Glenn Beck trying to take on the mantle of civil rights for himself, speaking to a mostly white crowd about how he was reclaiming the civil rights movement from politics. Now today, something that probably won't get as much attention because it's not as flashy, but something that is maybe even more dramatic because it's a more serious Republican figure making an even more radical claim has happened. Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour, the chair of the Republican Governors Association, the former head of the Republican Party, has just given an interview to the organization Human Events, in which he goes into great detail about his recollections of civil rights, segregation, race relations, and the modern Republican Party. Check it out.
The people that led the change of parties in the South, just as I mentioned earlier, was my generation.
Right.
My generation who went to integrated schools, or I went to integrated college, never thought twice about it. And it was the old Democrats who had fought for segregation so hard. By my time, people realized that was the past. It was indefensible. It wasn't going to be that way anymore.
My generation who went to integrated schools, I went to integrated college, never thought twice about it. That is Haley Barbour's history of segregation in the South. Essentially, it was all over by his time. That's not actually the real history. That's not even Haley Barbour's real history. Haley Barbour is 62 years old. He was born in 1947. He graduated as valedictorian of Yazoo City High School in Mississippi. Now, we can't be sure exactly what year he graduated from high school because his press office wouldn't respond to our requests for information today. But from what we do know, it seems like he got his high school diploma right around 1964 or 1965. Mississippi schools did not integrate. They didn't stop segregating students by race until the Supreme Court forced them to in 1970. Well after Haley Barbour, Mr. We Went to Integrated Schools, graduated from high school. A civil rights historian named Joanne Pritchard Morris, who taught in Yazoo City and knew Haley Barbour personally, told us today, quote, anybody who graduated from high school before 1970 in Mississippi did not go to an integrated school. Giving Haley the benefit of the doubt, he probably feels like he is of that generation, but he's not. After high school, Haley Barbour went to the University of Mississippi, better known as Ole Miss. Again, this was his recollection of his college years.
I went to integrated college, never thought twice about it.
Never thought twice about it. Again, we do not know exactly when Haley Barbour entered Ole Miss. Again, it's likely around 1965. That wasn't long after this man, James Meredith, became the first African-American to enter Ole Miss. He transferred in during the fall of 1962 and graduated in 1963. Today, an Ole Miss history professor, Charles Eagles, told us the next African-American undergraduate at Ole Miss transferred in during the summer of 1964. Again, right around the time that Haley Barbour started there. That same year, Ole Miss admitted its first black freshman, which means we think there were as few as 2 other African-American students. 2 African-American students on the entire Ole Miss campus, 2 out of 5,000 or so total students when Haley Barbour was in college there.
I went to integrated college, never thought twice about it.
2 students. By the time his senior year rolled around in 1968, Ole Miss had a grand total of 39 black students. That would make 0.7% of the student body, so 99.3% white. What was it like at Ole Miss for a black student then? Dr. Donald Cole, an African-American provost now at the school, told us today that he was expelled as a freshman in 1968 for protesting discrimination at Ole Miss. Among the conditions Dr. Cole remembers, there were no black faculty. There were no black athletes. So that was Haley Barbour's time, as he says, at an integrated college.
I went to integrated college, never thought twice about it.
Never thought twice about it. Haley Barbour argues in this interview that his generation not only didn't live segregation, didn't experience it, he also says Republicans like him in the South, they realized segregation was not only the past, it was indefensible. It should also be noted that as an adult, Haley Barbour married and had 2 sons. Mr. Barbour's 2 sons were educated in Yazoo City, too, just like their dad. Only Mr. Barbour sent them to private school. He put his sons in this particular private school, Manchester Academy. It was founded in 1969, when all-white private schools were popping up across Mississippi because public schools were being forced to integrate. According to press reports, Manchester Academy, where Haley Barbour sent his sons, Manchester Academy admitted its first black students in the year 1996. That's a year before one of Mr. Barbour's sons looks to have graduated from that school.
My generation who went to integrated schools, or I went to integrated college, never thought twice about it.
Again, the larger point here, whatever fantasy Haley Barbour is spinning about his own history and race and life in Mississippi, the overall point he is trying to make here, what he's trying to sell America on, is the idea that America should understand that the modern Republican Party is as dominant as it is in the South because it's so against segregation, because it was so post-racial.
The people that led the change of parties in the South, just as I mentioned earlier, was my generation. The people who really changed the South from Democrat to Republican was a different generation from those who fought integration.
I do not know what you fought or didn't fight, but what you lived is to a certain extent a matter of record. It really happened in real life. Other people were there. We can check these things. Joining us now is Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post and MSNBC contributor Eugene Robinson. Gene, thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Oh, it's so great to be here, Rachel.
Does Haley Barbour's history of race relations and political parties in the South square with your understanding of race relations and political parties in the South?
Well, gee, Rachel, I was there too.
Yes.
And do you mind if I just rant a little bit?
Oh, Gene, allow me to pop popcorn, but you just go.
Well, look, there was a time, yes, when the Democrats were Dixiecrats and the Democratic Party was a party of segregation. Then came a little thing called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, that was passed by Lyndon Johnson, who was seen by many white Southerners as a race traitor. Johnson said predicted at the time that his civil rights legislation would cost Democrats the South for a generation. He was being modest. Among the Republicans who opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was Barry Goldwater. Well, in the November election in 1964, Barry Goldwater against Lyndon Johnson, Goldwater won precisely 6 states. He won his home state of Arizona, and he won 5 states in the Deep South. He won Louisiana, Mississippi, Haley Barbour state, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. I wonder why. It was the first time those Deep South states had voted for a Republican presidential candidate since Reconstruction. I wonder why. We all know why. It was because that was the moment when the Republican Party began to become the party of white Southern grievance, the party that was essentially resentful of the fact that there was integration, the party of private academies, which were started in places like my hometown of Orangeburg, South Carolina. And this idea that in the 1960s, in the mid-60s, segregation was somehow a settled matter, that we were all done with that. My generation was so enlightened. Well, you know, in my hometown, again, there was an incident called the Orangeburg Massacre in which 3 black students were killed by state troopers in a demonstration that had begun over a segregated, all-white bowling alley in the middle of town. The year was 1968. The news of Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act must have traveled by Pony Express to reach those Deep South states. But this was by no means a settled question. And Haley Barbour's version of events is the biggest bunch of revisionist claptrap I think I have ever heard in my life. Thank you, and rant over for now, but I reserve the right.
I would like to just actually cancel the rest of the show and put that on a loop, if you don't mind. But, Gene, let me ask you about this, though, because Haley Barbour making up his own history about this is an interesting thing about Haley Barbour, who's considered to be a very credible Republican candidate for president, among other things, in 2012. But it seems like it fits this larger this larger Republican effort right now. The Republican Party's website right now, they have their list of accomplishments. It is as if all they've ever done is work on civil rights, like in the military, at Ole Miss, and in Little Rock. They wrote Brown v. Board. They are making the case for themselves as the party of civil rights, and Democrats have been lying to you about that. How do you understand this overall strategy?
Well, first of all, I find it really hard to remember those phalanxes of young, white, liberal Southern college students who were standing with the civil rights marchers, at least in my hometown. We must have missed out on that. You know, and also, I seem to recall, by the way, that during this period, like, all the black people left the Republican Party and went to the Democratic Party for a reason. It seems to me there are two possibilities. The generous one is that this is perhaps the way Haley Barbour would like to remember his racial attitudes and his history of the period of the 1960s. Maybe he likes to think that that's what he thought and that's the way he behaved. The more cynical view of it would be that this is not really an appeal for the African American vote, which they're not going to get, and not really a serious attempt to rewrite the history books, but just to kind of muddy the water and soften the edges, and perhaps allay the concerns of, say, white suburban independents who would perhaps vote for a conservative, but perhaps not vote for a bigot, and so I think this appeal really isn't for the black vote. It's to try to be a part of you know, this stirring chapter in American history and blur the historical edges, which we will not allow to be blurred, because what happened happened. The South has changed an awful lot. I think it's perfectly appropriate, and it's very good to look at the new South and how it's different from the old South. But in fact, we will not forget what the old South was like.
That's absolutely right. It is on the record. People can still tell the tales. We have the photos. We have the people who experienced it, and this stuff cannot be rewritten. I couldn't agree with you more, and I look forward to keeping those edges sharp with you into the indefinite future, Gene. Thank you.
Great to be here, Rachel.
Eugene Robinson, of course, a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post, MSNBC contributor, and I'm very happy to say my pal. I'm always happy it's on this show. All right, so it was a debate for the ages. The incumbent seems to lose all sense of where she is and what she's supposed to be talking about. She resorts to nervous giggling, looking around and grinning maniacally at the camera while saying nothing for very long stretches of time. And that's before we get to the part about the fake